Welcome to Cybersecurity Awareness in the Extortion Era. My name is Cody Delzer. I'm a Senior Vice President, Information Security Consultant with SBS Cybersecurity, a cybersecurity firm based in Madison, South Dakota that I've been with for 12 years. Today we're going to talk about various cyber threats that you as a business face. Specifically, we're going to dive into ransomware, business email compromise, and account takeover. We're also going to talk about social engineering because social engineering is usually the way in for these different types of attacks to manifest. And then we'll talk about some things that you can do to prevent this from happening. We'll talk about NIST's top 20 controls for small businesses, how to protect your data with encryption, different education that you can give to your employees. We'll talk about controls for remote workforces, password managers, multi-factor authentication. And we'll talk very briefly about having a good incident response plan and what that means for you and for your employees. But before we dive into this, recognize that you are of value to a hacker or to a hacking organization. What do you have that's valuable? Well, your customer information is valuable, right? That includes social security numbers, bank account numbers, birth dates, addresses, contact information. Your employee information is valuable to a hacker for the exact same reason that customer information is. Obviously, there's the corporate espionage aspect, right? So you've got sensitive corporate information in the form of trade secrets, software licenses, etc. Your email accounts are valuable to a hacker, right? A hacker can compromise your email accounts and harvest some of that customer information or sensitive corporate information, right? We keep a lot of stuff in our emails. That information can be harvested, but we can also use that stolen email account to send further attacks downstream as a trusted source. Social media accounts are in fact valuable for the same reason as an email account, right? We can become a trusted entity with which we can use to launch attacks farther downstream. Additionally, think of how many different web applications accept Facebook as a login or Twitter as a login. So if I'm able to harvest somebody's social media account, I can access various other web apps just from that one harvest. And then obviously your computer assets, right? Computers can be used by hackers to host their own information, serve as pivot points for other attacks, perhaps launching DDoS attacks downstream. So what are the seven most common causes of data breaches? Okay, you see social engineering in here, right? Social engineering, far and away, that's how they get in. So social engineering, 95% of the time, if an attack happens, it's likely because somebody was tricked into doing something that they shouldn't do. Once you get in the door, right, then we use weak passwords and stolen credentials in order to gain persistence, pivot to other targets. We can also use backdoors and application vulnerabilities, right? So we can either do these attacks from an authenticated method with those credentials or an unauthenticated method through various backdoors or application vulnerabilities. We can install malware. Oftentimes, too many permissions exist on the accounts with which we're able to harvest, right? So individuals are able to access things that they shouldn't have access to. There's the insider threats, right? And that doesn't even necessarily mean, when we say insider threat, it doesn't mean that the person that's perpetrating the threat, quote unquote, is actively engaged in being problematic. It just means they made a mistake, right? So people are given access in order to do their jobs. They're trusted with that access. And if they fall victim to social engineering, well, that's part of the insider threat as well. And then, of course, improper configuration and user errors. Is there apathy for cybersecurity? Have we become so numb to the fact that these things are happening? We see it in the news, but we have this vision in our heads that this can't happen to us, right? We don't have anything of value. Well, I told you a slide or two ago that you do, right? We have lots of value. Or we're too small of a company for a hacker to target. I'm going to show you some stats that prove that that's not true, right? We're in a small rural area. No one knows who we are. Well, again, there's no borders here, right? If you're on the internet, you may as well be right next door or in India. IT will take care of it. We've got a firewall, so we're protected. We trust our people not to fall for scams. We've got insurance, so we're covered. Well, IT wants to take care of it. We've got a firewall that's one part of it, right? One part of defense in depth. We trust our people, and that's good, but we got to make sure that we're training our people. Social engineering is almost always the way in. We can trust our people, but our people do fall for things. Even the best tested organizations are still going to fail 2 to 4% of the time. We've got insurance, so we're covered. Well, but insurance is a risk transference, right? It's not risk control. Now let's dive into our first threat, ransomware. The first bullet point says ransomware is a type of malicious software designed to block a computer system or mobile device until a sum of money is paid. That was probably true before. I think now you see a different evolution of ransomware. We call it the same thing, but it's not as often a malicious software as it is organizations that get access to your networks and then live off the land, right? They get access, they maintain access, usually through stolen credentials. They might elevate their privileges, again, through stolen credentials. And then they end up using your own systems against you, right? So it's really not malicious software. It's just attackers doing command and control on devices on your network. But the end result is still the same, right? You're locked out of your networks. You're locked out of your systems. Your data is encrypted, and they demand money for it, right? And this is often spread through phishing emails, right? That's often our way in, and I've got a slide that'll demonstrate this again. And keep in mind, guys, a common thread these days too is they'll try to get you to pay to get your information unlocked, but they're also going to tell you that if you don't pay, they're going to release it to all their friends, right? So ransomware is also often data exfiltration. So they kind of try to get you in two different ways. Now let's look at some of the trends. And I think that this is good news, right? What we see here is that from Q1 2019 to Q4 2022, in the first, right, in the former Q1 2019, 85% of victims paid. However, and then farther down the line here, Q4 2022, only 37% of victims paid. What that's telling me, other than the fact that fewer people are paying, is that we have better backups, right? We have the ability to recover. This is good news. But then let's look at another stat. We look at the median size of companies being affected, right? That went up from Q2 2022, actually a pretty heavy spike. But if we were going to do an apples to oranges comparison here, Q1 2019 to Q4 2022, Q1 2019, the average organization was, let's call it 50 employees. In Q4 2022, it looks like about 250. So they're shooting higher, and they're also getting more money, right? The payments were up several, 58% was the average ransom payment. The median payment was up 342%. And guys, here's another very interesting one, right? These are the industries impacted by ransomware in the last quarter. And as you can see, there isn't really a favorite, right? That's a pretty evenly spread pie. What that tells us is that everybody is susceptible. Common ransomware attack vectors. If you look all the way back to almost the inception of ransomware, you can see that far and away the leading cause of infection was RDP. So RDP stands for Remote Desktop Protocol. So insecure Remote Desktop Protocol exposed to the internet allows these hackers in. But if you go all the way over to Q4 2022, that only takes up about 20% of infections anymore. And you can see where insecure RDP did a little bit of a dance with email phishing for quite some time. Email phishing is the leader right now. So again, hey, it's less than 50% of ransomware infections, but on par, it's still the most common attack vector. So what are some ransomware best practices? Right? First of all, train our employees, social engineering training. Train them often. teach them not to click on the link, teach them not to download the attachment. That can prevent that initial infection, right? Eliminate or secure remote desktop protocol facing the internet. Have good offline backups. You may also call those air-gapped backups. Those are the backups that no matter what, the attackers can't actually get to if they're on network. Implement multi-factor authentication on anything external and absolutely on administrative accounts. Multi-factor authentication has the ability to prevent almost all of these attacks. And then good patch management, right? Good patch management ensures that if there are vulnerabilities that are known, that we've closed those up so that they have to steal credentials. Next, we'll talk about business email compromise. Business email compromise actually can be several different types of attacks, but it all has to do with gaining access to one of your email accounts. Oftentimes, they'll go after someone, an executive or someone in the finance department, somebody that has access to sending out money, if sending out money is their objective. If they don't get someone like that, then usually it's just to harvest data or to send more attacks up or downstream, right? That's where we see something that we call vendor email compromise, right? It's the same motivation as business email compromise, but we're using the attack just to further the attack in a different direction. So if we look at FinCEN's statistics, generally speaking, a business email compromise nets an average of $50,000 in value, or a vendor email compromise nets an average of $125,000 in value. Right? And this is kind of what it looks like. In fact, oftentimes a business email compromise attack won't include a payload, right? It will just be identifying a target, getting in, grooming the target in order to follow their directions, exchanging information in hopes that money is wired out in the attacker's favor. So what are some red flags to look for, right? Unusual and or unexplained urgency, right? Last minute changes in wiring instructions or recipient account information, last minute changes in established communication platforms or email account addresses, communication only in email and refusal to communicate via phone or some other type of video platform, request for advance payment for services when previously not required, request from employees to change direct deposit information. Right? These are all red flags that a business email compromise either has occurred or is attempting to happen. So what are some best practices? First of all, know how to identify phished and or spoofed emails, right? So training. Be careful about what you post on social media. I could do an entire presentation on how to gather information on individuals based on open source information, so open source intelligence. Know your customer, ask questions frequently. Or in this case, know who you're working with and ask questions, right? They may not even know that they've been tricked. Follow callback procedures. Never transact money, right, based solely on an email. Educate your customers. Monitor for urgent requests. Verify changes to vendors or employee account information. Notify your bank if suspicious activities occurs, right? And absolutely, for certain, always enable multi-factor authentication on your email accounts. The next threat we'll talk about is account takeover. Account takeover is when a criminal uses stolen credentials to access a user's online accounts without permission. This could be as benign as your Netflix account or a Facebook account. It could be as much as your online banking account or a credit card account, for example. Or your Amazon account. For any account that you have where especially financial information is transacted or purchases are made, I encourage you to use multi-factor authentication where you can. More impactful is what we call corporate account takeover. It's very similar to account takeover, right? A criminal accesses an online account without permission. In this case, it would be a business's banking account. And there's a lot of value here, right? Because these corporate online banking accounts have the ability to send money externally through either ACHs or wire transfers, right? So these incidents on average cost a business about $200,000. Right? 66% of senior decision makers at small businesses still believe they're unlikely to be targeted by online criminals. Except if you have the ability to send money out, this is a very lucrative target, right? I can't stress that enough. By the way, this is your risk, right? If as a person your credit card gets stolen, you can call the bank. You're not liable for that money, but a corporate account does not get protected by Reg E the same way, right? If you lose this money, the bank may, I stress may, give you your money back, but they are not obligated to do so. So again, deploy multi-factor authentication for these accounts where possible. Require payment initiation under dual control. Have out-of-band confirmation for payment initiation. And establish and monitor exposure limits. The final threat we'll talk about is social engineering. So how to recognize fake emails. The very first thing to keep in mind is that an email should not solicit an emotional response. If you are not expecting the email, be cautious. Inspect the sender address. The very top one, cody.delzer@sbscyber.com, that's me. Cody.delzer at cybersbs.com is not me. Right? If they're sending it from an address that isn't what you expect, it's probably a fake email. Hover over the links to see where the URL takes you. If you hover your mouse pointer over the link, it will tell you where this is going. Look for obvious grammar or spelling error. Look for strange structures like generic gradings, urgent language, and generic closings. Here's an example, right? What do we see here? Well, the email that it's from, 19281647350 at CynthiaWilliamsLaw.com. First of all, that just seems suspicious to begin with, right? Look at the subject. New documents delivery confirmation. Or how about this one, right? This is playing on the recent COVID-19 stimulus checks. However, I'm pretty sure that none of these came in the form of American Express cards, right? So if, as you can see, please tap here to proceed, tap here to proceed. Well, we would say click, right? But if you hover over that link, it takes us to some Google Doc, right? That has nothing to do with American Express. Who's it from? Sale at delivery-157.765.info. Yes, this is clearly phishing, but they're not all that easy to identify, right? This is what it looks like if you were to receive a OneDrive document, right? And accounts receivables it's blurred out in this instance, but this is what they look like. However, there are ways around this too, right? If it's a difficult to identify phishing email and you think that maybe you should actually be getting this document, well, guess what? You have the ability to go out to OneDrive through the website in order to get it. And in this instance, this is looking at DocuSign, right? The one on the left, that's what it looks like if you get a DocuSign document. But hey, at the same instance, you can go out to the DocuSign website and you can log in and you can download it that way. Then there's stealing credentials, right? Let's say that maybe you do click on a link that you shouldn't have, or maybe you end up in a place on the internet following a phishing email, right? Not all is lost yet. Perhaps nothing was executed on the machine, but now you're at a fake website, right? And this looks like a Facebook login page, except as you can see, based on the URL at the top, this is not Facebook's login page. And if it's a really well-designed one, by the way, when you type in your credentials, it'll probably take you to Facebook. It'll just redirect. But at the same time, they are harvesting those credentials. So take a look at the link, right? The very top one, https://sbscyber.com. That's our email address. https://www.apple.com/iPhone. That's another address. How do you know if these are legitimate links? Well, you can enter these links. You can copy and paste them into places like VirusTotal, Google Safe Browsing, Norton Safe Web, unmaskparasites.com, and they'll tell you, right? And there's another thing that you can do. Look to the right of the https:// until you encounter the next first forward slash, right? The domain directly to the left of that first slash is the true destination. So following that example, if we look at this URL, https://www.apple.com.example.com/findmyphone, what is the true URL? Right? It's not apple.com. The true destination is actually example.com. And I encourage you to either take a screenshot of this or go out to our website and download it. This is one of our free downloads, but this is a very exhaustive list of social engineering red flags when it comes to phishing emails. So what do we do about this, right? First of all, do not click on any links that you are not expecting, that you do not know, right? If you're not sure about the email, err on the side of caution. I always like to say that there's no such thing as an email that requires less than a 24-hour response, right? So take the emotion out of it. If there was an emotional response that it was trying to elicit, take a deep breath and refocus your energy, right? There's no such thing as an email that requires an immediate response. If you're not sure that it's legitimate, have it checked on. And as always, do external validation, right? If we go back here, that's what this entire slide was about, doing external validation. If you think that you were supposed to get that document, log into the website. That's external validation. External validation in this case could simply be as easy as calling the person that sent you the email. And remember, training is vital. Let's talk a little bit about vishing. It's not quite as common as phishing, but it is a little bit more dangerous in the sense that if we're calling you, if we have you on the phone, we have the ability to modify the scenario midstream, right? If we send you a phishing email, it either works or it doesn't. We could send you another one, but again, it's either going to work or it doesn't. If I have you on the phone, I can modify the scenario midstream. Now, when we do these, there's 9 times out of 10, it's going to have a spoofed caller ID, and that is super easy to do. We used to use a system called SpoofTel. We would enter the number we want to call. We would enter my number. It would create a bridge. And then we would enter another number, and that's what it would show up on caller ID. Caller ID is a super old protocol, very easy to spoof. We could even change the pitch of my voice. So the idea here is that we're posing as a legitimate business in order to try to convince you to visit a website and enter information, to send us something. Here's some examples. Fake IRS, you're going to jail calls. Fake Microsoft support, you've got virus calls. Fake impersonating a bank, right? Your account has been compromised. Come out here and enter your credentials so that we can help secure it. So how do you identify somebody on the phone, right? I just said caller ID doesn't really work, right? We can spoof it so incredibly easily. What happens if a caller gives you the last 4 numbers of a social security number? Do you give them information? I would hazard a guess to say that you should not, right? I mean, there's a really good chance that your social security number has been stolen 2.5 times in the last 10 years. So it's not that it's Googleable per se, but social security numbers aren't necessarily the best way to identify somebody. And if a caller says they're with law enforcement, do you give them information? How do you know that they're with law enforcement? With these vishing phone calls, the prevention is very similar to with emails, right? Do some form of external validation. If it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. If you can't recognize the person that you're talking to, don't give them information, right? It's always best to ask questions rather than to provide information that you shouldn't. Now that we've talked about some of the threats, let's talk about ways that you can work to protect yourself and your customers' information. We'll start with a couple of common frameworks and then move into best practices. First framework we'll talk about is put out by the Center for Internet Security, and it's called CIS 18 Critical Cyber Controls. And these are common controls that we would expect to see in any well-managed environment. And they start at the very basic with simply inventorying, having a good inventory of and control of enterprise assets, along with software assets, right? It moves into data protection, secure configurations, account management, access control management, continuous vulnerability management, audit log management, email and web browser protections, malware defense, data recovery, network infrastructure management, network monitoring and defense, security awareness and skills training, service provider management, application software security, incident response management, and penetration testing. The next framework we'll talk about is NIST 7621, Small Business Information Security Fundamentals. And it's broken down into the following categories: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Under identify, it gives us topics such as knowing our employees, right? Performing background checks at least upfront at hire, perhaps ongoing as necessary based on the role of the individual. Making sure that everybody has their own unique user accounts and developing policies and procedures to ensure that those individual user accounts are managed appropriately and set up with a least privilege model. Under protect, we have restricting access permissions that's similar to least privileges that I just mentioned, having surge protectors and UPSs on your critical hardware, patching operating systems and applications, having firewalls, ingress and egress filtering, and using that geo-blocking capabilities. Still under protect, having secure wireless, right? Changing the admin passwords on those wireless devices, using at least WPA2 with AES encryption for the communications going from those wireless endpoints to the wireless access points, setting up guest networks where appropriate, hiding the SSID, which is the wireless identifier name, ensuring that you're updating the firmware on those wireless endpoints and wireless access points, having good web and email filtering, right? Have those content filters and spam filters set up, and make sure you set up DMARC, SPF, and DKIM, right? Those three controls are free, and they can go a long ways into helping ensure that you don't fall victim or your customers don't fall victim to a business email compromise attack. Also, email sandboxing. That one's a little bit of a higher level control, but I would absolutely encourage you to look into it. Encrypting data, right? Not just in email and when sending email, but on the laptops themselves, on the mobile devices. Encryption of data at rest. Ensure that you dispose of old computers, right? Don't just have your old equipment laying around. It's not as common anymore, but many of the older data breaches happen simply because somebody stole some old hardware. Make sure you're training your people, right? Your people are simultaneously your greatest risk and can also be your greatest defense if they're trained appropriately. So on the topic of training, train your employees. SBS uses KnowBe4. I get tested every week. Once a week, I get a phishing email. And as you can see here, here's some stats, right? If you've never tested your employees, the average fail rate is 31.4%. After 3 months, it drops to 16.4%. And after 12 months, the average fail rate is 4.8%. What does that tell us? That tells us that we can really close that gap in the human risk side, right? But it also tells us that it's never going to be perfect. So we need to train our people. It's one of the most powerful things that we can do, but it doesn't mean that we stop the rest of what we're doing. Continuing with NIST 7621, we get into detect. So make sure that we have installed and keep up to date antivirus software, preferably some newer next gen software with scripting control. The scripting control piece is what's going to protect you from modern ransomware variants. So look for things like Carbon Black or Cylance or SentinelOne. Make sure you're maintaining and monitoring logs. If anything were to happen and we had to do an investigation without those logs, it'd be really hard to tell what had happened and what was accessed and who we need to notify. On the topic of respond, build a good business continuity plan and a good incident response plan. By the way, a pandemic preparedness plan. And on the recover front, make sure that you have good data backups and make sure that you test those backups. Right? You don't know your backups are good unless you test them. Have good cyber insurance. Right? If everything else fails, the cyber insurance is there to help you pick up. Diving in a little deeper to some of those controls we just mentioned, backups are critical, right? Not just in case you delete a file you didn't intend to delete, but in case you have to recover from a ransomware attack. The very first thing to keep in mind is ensure that you are maintaining a 3-2-1 methodology for backups. And what that means is that there's always 3 copies of your data on 2 media types or in 2 locations, and one of those is offline, right? That offline or offsite copy might be the thing that saves you in the event of a ransomware attack. Make sure that your backups are complete and that they work, right? That means you got to test them, and you got to test them regularly. Make sure you have good cyber insurance. The first thing you probably think about when you hear cyber insurance is paying the ransom for a ransomware attack. Well, it can do that, but it can also cover indirect expenses of a breach, right? It can help pay for downtime. It can help pay for the cost to recover. It can provide you with a breach coach to help you at the liability side, right? To walk you through the different phases of follow-up to an attack, making sure that you're covering your bases and providing you the resources you need. Have good passwords, right? This one you can't stress enough. I would love it if passwords cease to exist. But until we get to that point, we have to do the best with what we have, right? So use strong passwords. If there's a default password, make sure you change it. Don't reuse passwords. Have complex passwords, right? By the way, complexity means, 3 of the 4, lowercase, uppercase, number, or special character. Make them long, right? Complexity and length. A sentence, for example, fits 3 of the 4. There's an uppercase, there's a bunch of lowercase, and there's a special character somewhere in there with punctuation. Password reuse is still a common practice. 52% of people reuse the same password for multiple, but not necessarily all accounts. Only 35% use a different password for all accounts. 13% reuse the same password for all of their accounts. But we have so many passwords, right? When you think about it, what do you have passwords for? Probably 40, 50, 60, 100 different web applications that you need a password for. So how do you manage it? How do you do it right? I would suggest looking into a password manager, right? Now, there has been some news recently about a particular password manager that got, quote, breached. And they actually finally released their final report on what was and wasn't accessed. And while we have pretty good reason to believe that none of the actual passwords were accessed under most circumstances, even if they had been, this is still a much better way to manage passwords than to shun password managers altogether, right? You get to avoid writing them down. It makes long, complex passwords for you. And all you have to do is remember the one way to get in, right? The initial access piece, the master password. I know that it's somewhat of a scary concept. I do encourage you to embrace them. I have, and it has made my world a lot easier and more secure. Look into multi-factor authentication. Minimally, you want to put it on anything that's externally facing, and by that I mean available on the internet, and anything with administrative privileges, right? So, what is multi factor authentication? Well, if a password is single factor authentication, right, it's something you know, then multi factor is two of the three, something you know, something you have, or something that you are. The most common type that we see is a combination of something that you know, a password, in association with something that you have, which would be a token, right? So it might look something like this. You type in your username and your password, it sends you a token on your phone to which you say, yes, this is me, and then access is granted. Realistically, guys, this is one of the most fantastic ways to protect yourself and your data. It's a stopgap between somebody stealing your credentials and those credentials being used to gain unauthorized access. Is it foolproof? No, nothing is. In fact, usually if something goes wrong, it's because once those credentials have been harvested and that token goes out and says, is this you, yes or no, then the user just clicks yes when they shouldn't have. So that's a training thing, and we can work on that too. Regardless, multi-factor authentication, one of the most powerful controls that you can put in place, also probably one of the simplest to put in place. If this next slide feels just a little bit out of place, like it maybe should have taken part at the beginning where I was talking about threats, I get it, I apologize. But the next two slides are going to talk about mobile devices. And what I want to do here is highlight how these mobile phones that we carry are very much computers, right? The threats that we face here and the controls that we use to protect it are inherently the same, right? Maybe not 100% by design, but the concepts are the same. Right? What are the threats that we face on mobile devices? Social engineering threats such as phishing, smishing, and vishing. There's wireless security considerations, out-of-date operating systems or applications. How many times have you looked at your phone and said, I don't want to update you right now, skip? There's bring your own device challenges, right? If you are operating an organization where employees are able to bring their own cell phones in and use them, or use them while being attached to different resources on your network or cloud services, those are challenges that are brought in with mobile devices. Having bad password hygiene or no password at all. But how can we protect ourselves, right? Again, like I mentioned, those controls are very similar. Have some type of mobile device management system, right? That makes sure that cell phones that are attached to your network or attached to your resources have certain controls in place and conform to certain standards. Also, very likely gives you the ability to remote wipe, right? Ensure that these devices have antivirus or anti-malware applications installed, that the applications that are installed are patched and updated. Make sure that you're educating the users on different types of social engineering tactics. Educate them on safe browsing habits. Educate or ensure that a screen lock is required and a secure password or biometric is used to unlock the device. Never share the device or password with anyone. Don't save confidential data on the device if possible. Don't use on open Wi-Fi. And if it's stolen, encourage your employees that if a device is stolen to report it to you, right? Because that's where that mobile device management system comes in. Hey, my device was stolen. Hey, my device was lost. We can wipe it. Some good physical security considerations. Make sure that USB ports that aren't being used are turned off or blocked. At least minimally that they're physically inaccessible to somebody that may be in the office or maybe around the computer that isn't supposed to be at it. Right? There's a couple of different attacks where we could put keyloggers on a computer simply by plugging it in, or a device we call a rubber ducky. Be on the lookout for shoulder surfing. Do not leave written passwords on your desk. That's where password managers come in. Lock your screen when you walk away from your desk, right? If the screen is open, the computer's open, then somebody can walk up and access the data that the employee has access to as though they were them. Don't leave a phone that has access to customer information out in plain sight. Secure confidential documentation. Don't leave it visible on your desk. And shred confidential documentation when you no longer need it. On the topic of remote workforce security, define usage guidelines for the equipment that's issued and data that's being accessed, right? And this can be done through an acceptable use agreement. Make sure that you're using a virtual private network if your architecture is of that nature, right? If you're a purely Office 365 environment, a VPN may not be necessary because you're accessing it securely through different methods. But if you have to remote in to your network, make sure that you're using a VPN, right? Do not use RDP without a VPN. That is one of the more common ways for ransomware to get into a network. Enforce strong passwords with multi-factor authentication, right? We're talking about remote workforce here, right? So I mentioned that we want MFA on anything externally facing. Well, that would be your remote workforce. Ensure that your endpoints are protected. Have a good AV product like Cylance or SentinelOne. Make sure you're patching, right? Have web filtering turned on. Have centralized logging so that all of these different remote devices are feeding their logs into one central location. Do not allow the use of personal PCs. Make sure that any device accessing corporate resources is issued by or managed directly by you, the organization. Discourage the use of open Wi-Fi, right? Don't go sit at a coffee shop and do your work unless you have these other controls in place. Ensure that the data on these mobile devices for remote workers is encrypted, right? They're already outside of the confines of the office, so we've lost a little bit of control there. But if the device is encrypted, if something gets lost, if the device gets lost, then the data can't be accessed. And always educate, right? Educate your users on social engineering, what to look for in different types of malicious activity, because the human firewall is the greatest line of defense. It's the last line of defense. It can be the greatest line of defense. And yet, at the same time, 95% of all successful cyber attacks is generally caused by human error, right? Humans are simultaneously the greatest defense and the greatest risk. Be prepared to respond. Have a good incident response plan, right? That may cover key items such as malicious software, unauthorized access, inappropriate usage, lost or stolen devices, service provider breaches, but do consider doing a test, right? Do a tabletop test. Get everyone together on the incident response team, present them with a scenario and various injects in which you give them a scenario and they talk through what you would do in a certain event. Now, we've got some resources out there that you can go get from our website, sbscyber.com, that can help you get down the path of having good incident response. But remember, at the end of the day, good security is up to you. Sometimes you have to be your own hero. Thank you for attending. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it educational. We did kind of have to breeze through some of those topics. There's obviously a lot more that we can expand upon. If you have questions, this is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.